Chicago, the Windy City, a place of ambition and industry, jazz and corruption, a city where steel met sweat, where the American dream was forged in skyscrapers and soot. But beneath the hum of the L trains and the neon of late-night diners, there were shadows, cold, suffocating shadows, where something unspeakable was happening. And in 1981, those shadows bled into the light. It started as it so often does with a disappearance. A woman, then another, and another. Each one vanishing in the dead of night, often near the same parts of town. West side, south side, sometimes near the highway off-ramps, sometimes just a few blocks from home. These weren't isolated incidents. Something sinister was crawling through the alleys of Chicago. The victims shared similarities. Young women, often sex workers or vulnerable individuals. The police, already strained by a city bursting at the seams with crime, did little. In that era, a missing woman, especially a woman on the margins, didn't always spark urgency. But what no one knew was that this was no ordinary killer. This was a crew, a cult, a collective of men bound not by greed or power, but by blood, torture, and satanic devotion. They would come to be known as the Chicago Ripper Crew. It was a case so brutal, so bizarre, that it remains one of the most disturbing criminal sagas in US history, a story of depravity, black rituals, and human suffering, largely forgotten outside true crime circles. And it all revolved around one man, Robin Gecht. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to command such horror. Born in 1953, Gecht was a married father, with children working as a subcontractor in construction. He was even rumored to have worked briefly for John Wayne Gacy, another serial killer who haunted Chicago just a few years earlier. But while Gacy worked alone, Gecht wanted followers, and he found them. Edward Spritzer, a 21-year-old with a timid appearance, but a savage capacity for violence. And the Coccarelli brothers, Andrew and Thomas, who would become the right and left hands of Gecht's brutal rituals. Together, they formed a pact. Not one of loyalty or friendship, but of submission. Gecht was their priest, their master, their god, and what they worshipped was pain. According to court records and confessions later given by crew members, Gecht had a makeshift altar in the attic of his home, red curtains, black walls, candles, a strange red box that he guarded obsessively. He called it his church, and it was there after their hunts that they would return to perform dark rituals involving body parts, blood, and incantations. The Ripper Crew didn't just kill, they performed ceremonies. They would abduct women, often prostitutes or those alone at bus stops, and bring them to a van Gecht had modified for torture. Inside the van were tools, restraints, knives, a red-bladed hatchet. Once inside, the women were assaulted, mutilated, and in the most horrifying detail, their breasts were amputated, often while they were still alive. Gecht would then take the severed breast to his attic altar and perform a blood ritual, a twisted Eucharist of his own design, during which the crew claimed to consume parts of the tissue. The women were then killed and dumped, sometimes in alleyways, sometimes in forest preserves, always discarded like trash, their bodies marked with the same horrific pattern. The killings began in earnest in the spring of 1981. On May 23rd, Linda Sutton, a 28-year-old mother of two, vanished. Her body was found 10 days later in a field behind a motel in Villa Park. She had been brutalized in ways too graphic for newspapers to print. But the detail that stood out to investigators, her left breast, had been surgically removed. No one knew what to make of it. There was no precedent, no clear motive, no suspects. Over the next year, more women went missing. Their bodies found days or weeks later showing similar mutilations. Most of the press assumed a lone maniac was on the loose, a copycat of Gacy perhaps. But the pattern, the surgical precision, the ritualistic cruelty hinted at something else, something organized. Still, the case stalled. There were no witnesses, no surveillance. DNA technology didn't yet exist, and the victims, mostly women of color, drug users or sex workers, received little attention from the public or the media, until the crew made a mistake. On December 6, 1982, Beverly Washington was abducted near the north side of Chicago. She was 20 years old. She had been working the street when a red van pulled up beside her. The man inside offered her a ride. She got in, and then everything went black. Beverly was raped, mutilated, and left for dead. The Ripper crew believed she was finished, but she survived. She was found barely alive near some railroad tracks. One breast had been removed. Her body was broken, but she remembered the van, the man, the details. Her survival changed everything. Using Beverly's description, police began tracking red vans across the city. They discovered one registered to Edward Spreitzer, a young man with no criminal record, but a nervous demeanor that raised suspicion. Investigators brought him in for questioning, and under pressure he cracked. What he confessed to was unlike anything the detectives had heard. He didn't just name himself. He named Robin Gecht, the Coccarelli brothers. He described the rituals, the mutilations, the murders. He led them to crime scenes, told them where to find evidence, and what police uncovered would shake them to their core. In Gecht's home, they found the attic altar, candles, the red box, photographs, pornographic magazines, surgical instruments, and the blood-soaked remnants of past rituals. It was no longer theory, it was real. The Chicago Ripper crew existed, and they had murdered, according to confessions, at least 18 women, possibly more. But the story was just beginning. It's one thing to hear of a murder, even a brutal one. But when detectives sat in a Chicago interrogation room and listened to Edward Spreitzer describe what had taken place over the last 2 years, they didn't hear about murder. They heard about devotion. The story spilled out in fragments at first. Spreitzer at 21 looked more like a scared teenager than a sadistic killer. Thin, soft-spoken, shaking. But as he began to talk, the room shifted. He told investigators about Robin Gecht, about the van, about the women, about the rituals. He said Gecht was a man of God, but not the God most knew. Gecht had created his own theology, his own scripture, one written in blood. In this belief system, the mutilation of women was a holy act, a sacrament. The breast was the seat of feminine power, Gecht taught. To possess it was to steal power back. And in Gecht's attic chapel, the breast became a relic. Each killing, Spreitzer said, began with the hunt. They drove the red Dodge van through the streets of Chicago, West Side, South Side, near the expressways. They looked for women who were alone, vulnerable, prostitutes mostly, sometimes runaways. They offered money, a ride, a fix. Sometimes they simply grabbed them. Once inside the van, the woman was restrained, gagged. Then the ritual began. Spreitzer described a small red box that Gecht kept locked. Inside was a knife, a chalice, and something he called the scriptures, handwritten pages of twisted liturgy that Gecht recited while performing the mutilations. He would speak in tongues, chant, and sometimes sing hymns backwards, all while the woman lay screaming, or worse, silent. Gecht always began with sexual assault, but he rarely finished with it. He would then remove one breast with a surgical blade or a wire, cleanly, methodically, like he was cutting into fruit. He placed the tissue in the red box. Then at home, the 4 men would kneel before the altar. Gecht would place the breast on a small scale, weigh it, and pass it around. Each member of the crew was required to consume part of it, sometimes raw, sometimes cooked. They called it communion. Spreitzer's story would have sounded insane if it weren't for the bodies, the matching wounds, the survivors, and the other 2 crew members who told nearly identical stories when confronted. The Coccarelli brothers, Andrew and Thomas, were slower to confess. But eventually they did. And what they revealed wasn't just depravity, it was indoctrination. They claimed that Gecht had complete psychological control over them, that he was a prophet, a god. He spoke of Satan, yes, but not the one from the Bible. He believed Satan was liberation, and that suffering, especially the suffering of women, was the price of power. He didn't just commit murder, he theologized it. Psychologists brought in by the prosecution would later describe the group as a fusion of a cult and a death squad. Robin Gecht, they said, displayed classic signs of narcissistic psychopathy, charm, control, total lack of empathy, and the ability to manipulate others into committing acts they never would have dreamed of alone. He had no known history of ritual abuse, no ties to the occult, not publicly. He was a family man, a construction worker, but behind closed doors, he had created a world where pain was worship, death was ritual, and flesh was currency. But when it came time to face justice, Gecht didn't say a word. He denied everything. While his followers broke down in tears, confessed, and gave statements that matched across months of interrogation, Gecht held his ground. No comment. No cooperation. No emotion. His home, the attic, the red box, the altar, had all been dismantled and catalogued as evidence. Still, he claimed innocence, but the court saw otherwise. The first to stand trial was Edward Spreitzer. His charges: multiple counts of murder, rape, aggravated battery, and attempted murder for Beverly Washington. His defense tried to argue psychological coercion, that he was merely a pawn. But the jury didn't buy it. He was sentenced to death. Then came the Coccarelli brothers. They pled guilty, cooperated. Their sentences were reduced life in prison with the possibility of parole. Many believed they had been manipulated into the crimes, though their hands were never clean. But Gecht, the man at the center, was the most difficult to prosecute. He was never charged with murder. Why? Because there wasn't enough direct evidence linking him to the mutilations. His followers had confessed yes, but there were no fingerprints. No physical evidence tying him to a specific body. The rituals, the box, the altar, all deeply incriminating but circumstantial. So instead, prosecutors charged him with sexual assault. He had raped a 15-year-old girl in a completely separate case, one that predated the Ripper Crew's activities. It was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to 120 years in prison. As the courtroom cleared, one of the detectives turned to the press and said, "He'll die behind bars." That's all that matters. But it wasn't enough for everyone, because while the courts had convicted men, justice felt incomplete. There were still open cases, still missing women, still questions. Were there more victims? Was there a fifth member? Had the crew started killing before 1981? And the darkest question of all, did Gecht really believe in Satan? Or was that just the story, the mask he used to give his sadism meaning? Some experts believe the satanic element was exaggerated both by Gecht and the media. It was the early 80s after all, the height of the Satanic Panic. Across America, every crime, with even a whisper of ritual, was branded as devil worship. Prosecutors leaned into it. So did newspapers, but others weren't so sure. They believed Gecht had invented his own form of Satanism, a theology of pain, a belief system that was more about domination than dogma, where evil wasn't summoned by demons, but by permission. He didn't need horns and pitchforks. He needed silence, compliance, obedience. By the summer of 1984, the trials were over. The press had moved on. The courtrooms were quiet again. And in Chicago, the Ripper Crew's name began to fade. Slowly, uneasily. Not because the public had healed, but because the system preferred forgetting. There were no Netflix documentaries, no streaming specials, no podcast empires built on their story. The world just looked away. And that silence, that collective desire to not confront what had happened, may have been the Ripper Crew's final crime. In the years that followed, the nation was swept up in what would come to be known as the Satanic Panic, a wave of fear and moral outrage that consumed the 1980s and early 90s. Everywhere you looked, people were seeing demons. It began with Whisper's daycare workers accused of child abuse, based on bizarre claims of black magic. Then came books like Michelle Remembers, filled with lurid tales of satanic cults hidden in American suburbs. Talk shows and preachers declared war on the devil himself, claiming he had infiltrated everything from heavy metal music to role-playing games to after-school programs. And in the shadows of all that noise, the Chicago Ripper Crew vanished from the narrative. Why? Because their story didn't fit the script. The Satanic Panic loved conspiracy. It thrived on the idea that Satanism was a nationwide underground, a single hidden enemy responsible for thousands of crimes. But the Ripper Crew wasn't connected to that fantasy. They weren't part of some vast network. They were 4 men, 1 leader, 3 followers, operating not under the banner of Anton LaVey or any known occult organization, but under Gecht's own invention, a theology of pain and domination shaped around his sadistic urges. That didn't make for a convenient TV segment. It didn't sell as easily, so it was ignored. Meanwhile, real victims, women mutilated and discarded across Chicago, were left in the margins. The names of the dead never became national talking points. Linda Sutton, Sandra Delaware, Shumack, Rose Davis, Lorraine Borowski. You've likely never heard of them, but their pain was real. Their families received little. No media attention, no support, no national outrage. just silence. Because the truth was inconvenient, the Ripper crew hadn't been devil worshippers in the Hollywood sense. They didn't wear robes or chant in Latin. They weren't possessed. They were predators. And what they worshipped was power, not the power of Satan, but the power of fear. Robin Gecht crafted a mythology around himself. He turned suffering into scripture. He made his followers believe that mutilation was worship, that murder could be transcendent. And in doing so, he became something far more dangerous than a madman. He became a teacher. In psychological terms, Gecht was a charismatic sadist, someone who builds a system of belief to justify what he already wants to do. He didn't find religion and become a killer. He found killing and then invented the religion to rationalize it. And it worked. The Coccarelli brothers, both barely out of adolescence, submitted entirely. Spritzer, awkward and socially lost, found meaning in Gecht's words. They didn't kill because they were brainwashed. They killed because they belonged. And Gecht, he orchestrated everything and then slipped through the cracks. In the years after his conviction, he has refused interviews. He doesn't speak of the case. No remorse, no admissions, no apology. He remains incarcerated, aging in silence, while his crimes are quietly being forgotten. Meanwhile, Edward Spritzer, once on death row, had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in 2003, when Illinois abolished the death penalty. He remains in prison. Thomas Coccarelli died in custody. Andrew was paroled in 2019, a fact that horrified many, especially the families of the victims, because even though the crimes were ritualistic, sadistic, and by every measure serial murders, they were never fully treated as such. No national registry, no ongoing cold case task force, no documentaries dissecting the pathology of the killers, just a few mentions in out-of-print books, a paragraph or two in true crime encyclopedias, a cult footnote to the more notorious Gacy. Why? Because the Ripper crew revealed something we didn't want to face. That evil doesn't need a massive cult. That Satanism can be just a mask, a tool used by narcissists and sadists to elevate their cruelty into something meaningful. And that the worst monsters can look like anyone. Gecht lived in a quiet neighborhood, went to work, had kids, drove his van through the same streets as everyone else. His victims weren't chosen for revenge or profit. They were chosen because they were available, because they could be taken without being missed, because the system didn't care. And maybe that's why this story never went viral, never made national headlines for long. Because it's not just a story about evil, it's a story about neglect, about how justice can fail, about how the media can ignore the voiceless, about how society can bury trauma when it's too uncomfortable to examine. Chicago remembers many things: the gang wars of the 20s, the Great Fire, the legend of Al Capone. But when it comes to the Ripper crew, one of the most brutal serial murder cases in American history, the memory is blurred, scattered, and largely ignored. It's not because it wasn't real, it's because it was too real. Because what Robin Gecht and his followers did wasn't cinematic. It wasn't stylized horror. It was blood and bone, pain and flesh. And it happened in alleys, in vans, in forgotten lots. It happened to women the system never really protected and never truly mourned. And that's where we begin this final chapter with them. Linda Sutton, 28 years old, a mother of two, abducted in May 1981. Her body was discovered behind a motel in Villa Park, mutilated, her breast removed with surgical precision. She had dreams. She had children. She had a life. The press called her a prostitute. They printed that word in bold. They didn't mention her kids. Lorraine Laurie Borowski, 21, a secretary at a real estate office in Elmhurst, abducted just outside her workplace in May 1982. Her body was found 5 months later in a cemetery, battered, bound, raped, mutilated. Her family held a funeral with a closed casket. They described her as kind, funny, never afraid of anything. She should have been afraid of them. Shumak, a 30-year-old woman of Asian descent, found stabbed to death, breasts removed. Very little is known about her. No one ever claimed her publicly. To this day, her story remains largely unreported, a name on a sheet, a life extinguished. Sandra Delaware, 18 years old, a runaway. Her body was discovered in the Chicago River. She'd been tied with electrical wire, sexually assaulted and mutilated. Her killers left her under a bridge like she didn't matter, like she never did. Rose Davis, 30 years old, found dumped behind a South Side abandoned building. Like the others, she'd been raped and mutilated. She had 2 jobs. She was just trying to survive. And then there was Beverly Washington, the one who lived, the woman whose survival broke open the case, the woman who remembered the red van, who gave police the key details, who testified, who stood broken but not silenced in a courtroom and pointed at Edward Spreitzer and said, "That's him." Her strength saved lives. But where is her story today? Why has it never been told in full? Why has she never been honored the way she deserves? Because survival is messy. It doesn't fit neatly into the media cycle. Survivors are complicated, traumatized, often left to fend for themselves. Like so many others in this case, the victims weren't just forgotten by the public, they were forgotten by the system. Their murders went unlinked for over a year. Their bodies sat in the morgue waiting for names. Their families were told implicitly and explicitly that they didn't matter as much. Because they weren't rich. Because they weren't white. Because they worked in clubs or stood on street corners or simply walked home alone at the wrong hour. But that's what the Ripper crew counted on. They counted on silence, on indifference, and for a time they were right, but not forever. Because stories like these, when they're told honestly, without myth, without glamour, reveal something vital about who we are, about what we value, about how we respond when evil wears an ordinary face. The Ripper crew didn't look like monsters. Gecht lived in a modest house with a clean-cut lawn. Spreitzer was quiet, unassuming. The Coccarelli brothers looked like any working-class kids in the neighborhood, and yet they created a nightmare together and did it with a level of cruelty so profound it still echoes in the bones of the city. The case raised difficult questions. How does someone come to worship pain? How can a man convince others that mutilation is divine? And how many victims are still out there, unnamed, waiting to be remembered? The Chicago Police Department never officially linked all 18 murders to the Ripper crew. Some cases remain open. Some bodies have never been identified. The full truth, like the red box Gecht once carried, is still sealed. And yet the consequences ripple outward. The survivor, the families, the neighborhoods scarred by fear, the children who grew up hearing whispers of a van of candles of bodies left beneath the expressway, and the women of Chicago who for a time looked over their shoulders not at one man, but at the very society that allowed 4 of them to go unnoticed. There is no comfort in this story, no satisfying end. Robin Gecht remains in prison silent. Edward Spreitzer is still alive, serving life. One brother is dead, the other paroled, but the pain they caused still breathes. In cracked sidewalks, in back alleys, in the quiet that follows a scream no one answered. So what do we do with a story like this? We don't sensationalize it, we don't mythologize it. We remember it. We name the victims. We listen to the survivor. We confront the truth that evil doesn't need demons, or robes or candles. Sometimes it just needs neglect. Sometimes it needs a society willing to look away. And sometimes all it takes for a ritual to begin is for no one to interrupt it. The Chicago Ripper crew was not a legend. They were real. And the only reason they ever stopped was because one woman survived long enough to tell the truth.